By early July 1943, the Eastern Front had reached a moment of grim inevitability. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, German forces needed a decisive victory to reclaim strategic initiative. The answer,
must be crushed
in
here at all
Berlin's view,
costs. We
lay in a
cannot delay
massive
Operation
offensive
Citadel again.
aimed at crushing Soviet forces around the Kursk salient. What followed would become known as the Battle of Kursk, a confrontation defined not by speed or surprise, but by endurance, firepower, and human cost. South of Prokhorovka, near the small village of Teterevino, that larger strategy unraveled into something far more chaotic. On the afternoon of July 8, Soviet armored units received orders to attack and reclaim recently lost ground. The instructions were vague, the preparation was minimal, maps were unavailable, artillery support was absent, mechanized infantry essential for protecting tanks in close combat had been left behind. Yet orders, once given, were not questioned. 32 T-34 medium tanks and 21 lighter T-72s began to move forward. Engines roared, tracks bit into the earth. For the crews inside, visibility was limited to narrow optics and periscopes smeared with dust and smoke. Commanders struggled to maintain situational awareness, while also serving as gunners an exhausting and dangerous dual role that slowed reaction times at the worst possible moment. Ahead of them, German infantry clung to shallow trenches along a railway embankment. Shells churned the ground. Machine gun fire snapped overhead. The defenders were outnumbered and under intense pressure, but they were not unprepared. New anti-tank weapons, shaped charge grenades designed for close assaults, were distributed among soldiers who understood the risk. To stop a tank, one had to let it pass overhead. As Soviet armor surged forward, the battlefield erupted. Tanks rolled directly over German positions. Infantry waited in suffocating silence, then struck at the vulnerable rear armor. Some attacks failed, others succeeded at terrible personal cost. Burning wrecks began to dot the approach, but the Soviet advance did not slow. Momentum, once committed, became its own command. Neither side yet understood the full shape of the fight unfolding. To the Soviets, resistance seemed fierce, but fragmented. To the Germans, the attack appeared massive, relentless, and poorly coordinated. What neither side fully grasped was that chance mechanical failure, delayed movement, a single vehicle out of position was about to shape the engagement in ways doctrine never predicted. This was not yet legend. It was simply confusion, pressure, and steel moving toward collision. By the time the first Soviet tanks crested the railway embankment, the battle near Teterevino had already slipped beyond careful planning. Smoke blurred distance. Explosions erased landmarks. Orders dissolved into instinct. It was in this chaos that a single German heavy tank delayed, isolated, and never intended to engage entered the fight. The vehicle was a Tiger I, commanded by Franz Staudegger, an officer who had fallen behind his unit due to mechanical trouble. The suspension had only just been repaired. The situation was imperfect. The odds were worse. Yet, as 3 Soviet T-34 seconds rolled into view without tight formation, opportunity revealed itself with brutal clarity. Staudegger did not hesitate. The first 88mm round cut through the haze like a verdict. It struck the lead tank squarely through the frontal armor, halting it instantly. The second followed moments later. Another T-34 erupted into flame. The third managed to react its turret, turning just in time to betray awareness before it too was silenced. In little more than a minute, 3 Soviet tanks were destroyed without a single effective return shot. But the battlefield did not pause to acknowledge precision. More movement followed. Another tank appeared over the embankment, then another, then many more. The bulk of the Soviet counterattack had arrived, spreading across the open field in growing numbers. From a tactical perspective, the danger was obvious. A lone heavy tank risked being flanked, overwhelmed, or immobilized by sheer volume of fire. Staudegger responded not with retreat, but motion. The Tiger began to shift positions, constantly firing, relocating, firing again. Soviet shells began to strike the German tank, slamming into its armor with deafening force. The impacts echoed inside the hull. Paint peeled, steel rang, yet penetration never came. The Soviet 76mm guns, deadly in other circumstances, struggled against the Tiger's frontal protection. Confidence settled in. No bravado, but control. Target. Fire. Another T-34 burned. Then another. The Soviet crews now understood the threat, but understanding did not equal solution. As they rushed forward across open ground, the German gun continued its work with methodical precision. Hits accumulated on the Tiger's armor dozens, then more, each one a reminder of how narrow the margin truly was. Then came a critical moment. The Tiger's supply of armor-piercing ammunition ran dry. Under ordinary conditions, this would have marked withdrawal. Instead, the crew switched to high-explosive rounds. Accuracy suffered, lethality diminished, but the psychological effect remained devastating. What had begun as a massed assault was now unraveling under pressure, noise, and loss. One by one, Soviet tanks reversed course, retreating back toward the railway embankment that had once promised advantage. The field fell briefly silent, littered with burning wrecks. Yet even then, the engagement was not finished. Against conventional logic, the Tiger advanced. The heavy tank crossed the open ground, climbed the embankment, and surprised regrouping Soviet crews who believed themselves momentarily safe. More shots followed, more wrecks were added. By the time the firing ceased, over 20 destroyed tanks smoldered across the battlefield. The Tiger remained operational, scarred by dozens of impacts, but alive. From a distance, it looked like legend in the making. Up close, it was exhaustion, risk, and survival balanced on steel. For the Soviet crews advancing toward Teterevino, the battle did not unfold as a sequence of targets and victories. It unfolded as confusion, noise, and narrowing vision, each moment more disorienting than the last. Captain Leonid Raigorodskii commanded his T-34 from inside a steel compartment filled with smoke and vibration. Like many Soviet tank commanders of the period, he was burdened with dual responsibilities. He was both commander and gunner, forced to divide attention between observing the battlefield and engaging the enemy. The limitations of this arrangement would soon prove fatal. Orders had come quickly and without detail. 2 villages were to be taken. Resistance was expected, but its form and strength were unknown. There were no updated maps, no artillery support, no mechanized infantry advancing alongside the armor. The attack moved forward regardless, driven by urgency rather than clarity. As Soviet tanks crested the railway embankment, reality struck with violent immediacy. Burning wrecks littered the ground ahead tanks that had crossed moments earlier and never returned. Explosions tore into advancing formations. Mortars fell. Anti-tank grenades detonated at close range. Somewhere beyond the smoke, an unseen enemy delivered precise, punishing fire. Each muzzle flash was distant, almost invisible, yet its effect was unmistakable. Raigorodskii searched desperately through his optics. His world had narrowed to a handful of shapes and flashes. He spotted the faint glimmer of a distant gun and fired. The recoil rocked the turret. Smoke filled the compartment. Whether the shot landed meant nothing, there was no way to know. Around him, Soviet tanks fired in volleys, saturating suspected positions, but volume did not equal effectiveness. One by one, vehicles were struck and disabled. Crews burned. Radios crackled with overlapping voices, calls for coordination, warnings, panic. None of it forming a coherent picture. The situation deteriorated rapidly. German fire intensified. A heavy tank, still unseen in full form, continued to strike with unnerving consistency. Soviet shells slammed into armor that refused to yield. Each failed penetration carried its own psychological weight. What had seemed like resistance now felt like inevitability. Finally, the order came. Retreat. The command passed through the radios with grim clarity. One by one, surviving tanks reversed course, backing away under fire. Bullets and shells chased them toward the railway embankment that now represented survival rather than advantage. Engines screamed. Drivers pushed for speed. Crews prayed for distance. Raigorodskii's tank joined the withdrawal. Then the battlefield delivered its final verdict. An 88mm shell crossed the open ground with lethal precision. It struck the T-34 cleanly, tearing through armor that had offered protection moments before. There was no heroism in the aftermath. No final words. Just another crew added to the expanding ledger of loss. By day's end, over 20 Soviet tanks lay destroyed. Some had fallen before reaching the embankment, likely victims of artillery or air attack. Others were lost in the killing zone beyond. In the chaos, individual responsibility blurred. Precision dissolved into probability. For the men inside the steel hulls, the battle left no legend, only silence, smoke, and absence. From a modern Western perspective, the engagement near Teterevino is less remarkable for the number of tanks destroyed than for how the event was later framed. What unfolded on that battlefield offers a case study in how wartime narratives are constructed and why they persist long after the smoke is cleared. German High Command credited the day's armored losses almost entirely to a single Tiger I and its commander. In official accounts, complexity vanished. Artillery strikes, infantry actions, and air attacks were quietly excluded. The chaos of overlapping fire was reduced to a clean tally. One man, one machine, one decisive stand. This simplification served a purpose. By mid-1943, Germany desperately needed symbols of technological superiority and tactical dominance. The Tiger tank became more than a weapon. It became an idea that represented control in a war increasingly defined by attrition. Elevating a single engagement into a heroic narrative reinforced morale and justified continued faith in heavy armor as a war-winning solution. American and British military historians, writing decades later, approached the episode with greater distance.
While the shelling reached a fever pitch in the
Ardennes, rather than
the
individual
ensuing ground offensive
From this angle, the Soviet failure was not the result of one extraordinary enemy tank, but of systemic issues: poor reconnaissance, fragmented command, lack of combined arms coordination, and inadequate communication under fire. The German success, meanwhile, was real but limited. Tactically, the engagement demonstrated how armor protection, fire control, and disciplined crew coordination could dominate an unprepared opponent. Strategically, it changed nothing. The broader offensive stalled. Losses mounted on both sides. Within weeks, German forces at Kursk were transitioning from attack to retreat, unable to replace men and machines at the rate demanded by the battlefield. For modern American doctrine, the lesson is familiar and enduring. Technology can amplify advantage, but it cannot compensate indefinitely for strategic imbalance.
The individual sacrifice
no
was
matter how
immense,
genuine,
yet it
cannot
was the
reverse a
sheer
campaign shaped by
industrial might
logistics,
that fueled the
industrial
conflict.
capacity, and political will. Perhaps the most important lesson lies in how history remembers combat. Battles are not preserved as they happen, but as they are told. The line between documentation and myth is often drawn after the fact by those with authority, audience, and motive. At Teterevino, the fighting ended in wreckage and silence. What followed was interpretation. And interpretation, once accepted, can outlast the war itself. When the battlefield near Teterevino finally fell quiet, there was no triumph in the air. Only smoke, twisted steel, and the lingering smell of burned fuel. A single German heavy tank stood among the wreckage, its armor scarred by dozens of impacts, its crew exhausted but alive. Across the field, Soviet machines burned where they had stopped, each one marking the end of men who had followed orders into uncertainty. In the immediate aftermath, the story seemed simple. A lone Tiger I had halted an armored advance. His commander was decorated. His actions were elevated into example and symbol. The image was powerful, and power has a way of shaping memory.
The deployment here suggests they anticipated the trench
when examined closely,
but the aerial photos contradict that timeline.
Simplicity. The engagement did not alter the course of the campaign. It did not restore German momentum, or slow the Soviet strategic advance. Within weeks, the broader offensive had failed. German forces would never again regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. What had looked like dominance at Teterevino proved to be an exception in a war increasingly governed by numbers, industry, and endurance. The true legacy of that day lies elsewhere. It lies in the men who fought without maps, without support, and without clear understanding of what awaited them beyond the embankment. It lies in the limits of technology, when separated from strategy. And it lies in the cautionary tale of how easily battlefield chaos can be transformed into legend once filtered through propaganda and repetition. For modern audiences, especially those far removed from the mud and smoke of 1943, the story invites restraint.
While
It
the shelling
reminds us
reached
that
a fever
individual
pitch in the
skill
Ardennes,
matters,
the
but it also
ensuing ground
reminds us how
offensive saw
dangerous it is
thousands
to
of
build
troops and
historical
armor
meaning
pushed
on
through the
isolated
unforgiving
moments.
snow.
Wars are not won by heroes alone, and they are not understood through numbers stripped of context. The scars left on steel eventually rust away. The lessons, if ignored, do not. So the question remains one worth asking long after the last shell fell silent. If we remember the battle only as legend, what truths do we risk forgetting? If this story challenged your understanding of armored warfare and wartime memory, share your thoughts below. And if you value careful, human-centered analysis of military history, consider joining us as we continue exploring the moments that shaped the modern world. The battle may be over, but history is still being written.